International. I have been on mute. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Nelson Mandela University Business School Business Rebound webinar series. Someone once said, the true test of leadership is how well you function in a crisis. Our guest today is Mr. Russell Roth, the president of Kotte International. Russell is an alumnus of the university, as well as a member of our International Advisory Board at the Business School. Today we've asked Russell to talk about what it takes to be a winner in the post-recession era. But before we get into Russell's talk, I would like us to observe a moment of silence for the victims of COVID-19, as well as other tensions throughout the world that we are facing today. So I'm going to ask you just to pause for a second with me. Thank you. Thank you. As we know, in the pandemic era, we are faced with several uncertainties and challenges in the world of business and the way we live and the way we work. And these uncertainties have brought about some vexing questions for us, one of which is the most important in terms of what will the future hold for us? And I think it's important for us to reflect on that in a way that will make us a little bit more certain about how we deal with the adverse situations we find ourselves in the world today. And we've asked Russell to give us some advice and a good talk on what winners do in situations such as the ones we are finding ourselves today. Russell, welcome to our series today. This is the second one in our series. The first one was hosted by Johan Jooster, also an alumnus and advisory board member. And we trust that you will enjoy the series with us. We have a number of people that will also be asking a number of questions towards the end of your talk. And so I will be then facilitating those sessions with you as well. Welcome, and thank you very much for making yourself available for us this afternoon. Thank you.
Randall, it's tremendous. You can hear me, correct?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. That's fantastic. Well, thank you for the invitation to chat today. I love talking about sort of the role that we can all play with respect to emerging out of what is certainly not a crisis that is by any means over. In fact, in some cases, it's probably intensifying even more. I'm coming to you from my office in New York, and we've had, like you, an abundance of cautionary activities that have taken place with the economy essentially shutting down, airlines stopping flights, immigration being affected, schools being affected, and a second wave that is now really starting to be very pronounced with respect to COVID. And of course, no one quite knows what's going to happen. So these are trying times indeed, but I think there are some things that we can look at, and I think some surprising strengths that we can draw from ourselves. And that's part of what I want to share with you today as we cover this. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I'll get this right. And if somebody can just give me a nod that you're getting it, that'll be tremendous. Thank you, Randall. Appreciate that. So here's what I'd like to sort of touch on a little bit. It's essentially sort of what we see are some of the strengths based on some of the research that we've recently done and some of the work that we've seen emerging in the midst of this horrible crisis. And I'll start off by saying that there's no in the near term, the human toll, whether it's from an economic induced impact as a result of people losing jobs and consequently livelihood, access to, just being able to pay the bond, pay the rent, get food, healthcare, and of course, on the other extreme is the actual health itself. My wife is a healthcare worker. She works in a hospital where she goes in and puts on her PPE to the extent that is possible. She treats COVID patients. And so I do think that there are people out there that are doing way more than certainly I'm doing, or we're doing even, to help individuals and humans to try and at least overcome some of the pain that no doubt we're all going to be experiencing. Quickly, I am, as Randall said, an alumnus, so I'm very proud to be from formerly UPE, Nelson Mandela University. That is my email address. I'm sure we can make it available afterwards if anybody wants to just reach out and connect or chat, whatever the case might be. I am always happy to do that. So look, what's interesting is that I think we've had all sorts of things, and I'm going to be coming at this largely from a behavioral science dimension. At Coda, we are behavioral scientists, essentially. We look at the science of human behavior and try and understand it with respect particularly to organizations. And what is interesting is that there are all sorts of external impacts that drive us to change what we do. So for instance, innovation. Something happens and all of a sudden we need to pivot or change our direction. We have probably seen in the digital realm, I heard Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, saying probably 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. And I actually think that that's a little bit, I don't think that's quite accurate. I think it's more like 4 or 5 years of digital transformation, because we've all had to shift so radically onto digital platforms that previously wouldn't have been even, we were trying to get there, but we found excuses for it, didn't we? We tried to work from home, but it just wasn't quite the same as being in the office. Well, now, of course, there is no option, and we've had to embrace these things at record pace. And the interesting thing about that, if we think about it for a moment, is that it does show some tenacity and human ingenuity, that we are actually able to, when faced with these situations, react in a really interesting way. And there's all sorts of things that force us to think about how we're going to react differently. The biggest one, though, is, of course, the downturn that's now coming out of COVID as a result of the COVID-induced downturn. Now, I would love to just get a sense from people, if you're able to go into the chat, and I think you have the option to chat. Go into the chat and just let me know where you are from. If you're from an organization, if you are from a non-for-profit organization, if you're just attending in your personal capacity. Is everybody able to get to the chat? Maybe if I stop my screen share, let me do that. Well, no, you should be able to get there. Let me see. I'm just trying to see if there are any comments coming in here. All right, there are a few. Thank you very much. Okay, great. IDC, someone from the business school. Thank you. Andrew Binning. Fantastic. All right, great. This is nice. It's good to see who's here. I appreciate you being engaged with me this way as well. It's really helpful. So we are gonna approach this from a business point of view today. And what I want to dive into is sort of, even though we have a lot of these changes that are impacting us, and we've got this downturn from COVID, one of the things that we find is that, Andy Grove talked about this, that we find ourselves complacent. When things are going fine, we become complacent. And part of the challenge now is how we trigger away from this complacency. He said only the paranoid survive. And at one point, everybody who was sort of running out and grabbing toilet paper and grabbing hand sanitizer was like, why are you so paranoid? And what's interesting about that is that it's actually not unexpected to anticipate that part of our human DNA is about survival. And in times of a crisis, when there is so much uncertainty, right? When there's so much uncertainty, we cannot predict what's going to happen. It does become almost a case where only the paranoid survive, the people who are running out to get it, because who knows when you're going to get it again. There's also this great quote that I picked up fairly recently from the International Comparative Management Journal, where it talked about complacency being that self-satisfaction, which I actually think is a really interesting way of talking about it. It's that self-satisfaction. It's like, I feel good with myself. And it's the self-satisfaction from the status quo, and it gives us this little security. But unfortunately, what that security also does is it ends up making us sort of a little bit blind, really, to, in some cases, the need for change. Because if everything feels good, we don't really feel we need to change. So the thing that we need to bust, the thing that we need to break, is the sense of complacency. And I don't suggest that we have it right now. But in some respects, there is so much uncertainty that we don't know how to act. And we're looking at our leaders, whether they are government and political leaders, whether they are the leaders of some of the biggest organizations, we're looking to see what they're telling us, because in an abundance of uncertainty, the role of leaders becomes even more important. So why don't we act? What are we waiting for? Well, there's all sorts of things, and there's this I'm not going to go through this whole list, but this was written, again, International Research Journal, talked about sort of 4 categories of reasons why people generally fail to act. One is, we may actually set up processes that make it really hard for people to act. What do I mean by that? Well, you may have a reward system that rewards not taking action, but instead reinforcing the status quo. So if somebody tries something different, think about this. If somebody's trying something different, are they rewarded for that even if it fails? Or is there punishment? Is there a punitive action that comes from it? Because we might know that there's a better answer, but we fail to act because we're scared of the consequence. Structure, organizations atrophy over time. It's like rust. It gets in and it settles in, and unless we're cleaning that thing every so often and making sure that it's really, really sharp, well, what's going to happen is it atrophies. And as it atrophies, it becomes cumbersome. And as it becomes cumbersome, the pipes get clogged, so to speak. Ideas can't flow fast enough. And so I've got to go and speak to my boss, who speaks to his boss, who speaks to her boss, and then she finally decides, all right, now you can go and do something, instead of just taking action and doing it. And one of the biggest things is culture, right? There's this whole culture of risk avoidance, or perhaps we're just so dependent on rules and procedures that we know that there's a better way, but we don't act as a result of the rules and the procedures, because that's our culture. And I think this is an interesting list, but I actually think there's one thing on here that probably is incomplete. And I would suggest the biggest reason is human behavior. The biggest reason why we don't act is because of some of our human behavior. And by this, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of some of our inherent traits. Now, what was interesting is I saw this article just a couple of weeks ago in the Financial Times. And it was tremendously well written, probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it says, every manager is having a midlife crisis, because all of a sudden, everything that we have done to become a manager or a leader has been anchored on our past, right? It's been anchored on everything that we've done up until now. So I got promoted because I did it a certain way. And so I kind of, in a way, expect people to do it that way too. All of a sudden now I'm working from home. I don't see my colleagues on a regular basis. In fact, I don't even know if they're working. And if they are working, how much are they working? What's being done? What's being dropped? Are people going to be honest and tell me when something isn't working? I don't know how to handle that. I've never been equipped with those skills. And so it's creating the situation right now where, frankly, we get to this point where there's a few things that we need to be very mindful of. There's a really great book written by Nelbuff and Dixit called The Art of Strategy. And what was interesting about it is it was all about game theory in a way, and talked about how, to win, what the ultimate game of strategy is to anticipate the move that your competitor or competitors may take ahead of them taking it, and then your reaction or possible reactions. It's a little bit like chess, but the point that they made is that there is both an art and a science involved with strategy. Now, the science part is interesting because we can study that and learn it to some degree. The art piece is that intrinsic sense of I just know what I'm going to do. Now, here's what's interesting about that. We can look at science, we can look at data, but what data exists around COVID and coronavirus? What data exists that tells us how we should act? There's nothing. It's unprecedented. No one living today has been through this scale and this magnitude of epic upheaval. So even though we would usually look at science and data, and it's all about a world of data right now, it only goes so far. On the flip side, on the art side, because we haven't experienced it before, and that's part of art. If you see a great dancer, or you see a great performer, or you see a great, sports person, it's become because they've practiced. None of us have had the opportunity to practice for COVID and Corona. So this is completely something that we're completely unfamiliar with. The second thing that's worth mentioning is that unconscious triggers that we have will harm us. And what do I mean by this? Well, there's all sorts of things that could potentially get in the way that we don't even recognize. So for a second, just to keep us interactive, I'm going to stop the screen share and I'm just going to come back onto me for a minute. Part of what we know is that from an evolutionary biology perspective, our brains are wired for survival, right? So I was born in Africa, and we'll often talk about how, whether it's, the cradle of humankind or whatever the case might be, but we look back at our origins throughout the world in Africa. And there's no reason why we should be alive, right? We're not the fastest species. We're not venomous. Well, most of us are not venomous. We actually rationalize a lot, which means that we're the only species that will consciously say, I want to eat less to lose weight. Like animals eat until they're satiated and then they stop eating, right? Humans are not always like that. So we rationalize a lot of things. We should not be alive, but we are, because we have a lot of defaults that are frankly built in our brain that inform how we act or how we react. Now, the unconscious triggers we have is that there were some fascinating studies that were done. I don't know how many of you like snakes. Let me know in the text if you like snakes. Give me a thumb up or a thumbs down. I am not a particularly huge snake fan myself. And I guess partly because, all right, thank you, Sue. I'm glad that you don't like them either. And it's partly, it comes from the fact that to some degree, I grew up believing that snakes were not safe, that snakes were not pets, that snakes were not the kind of thing you cuddled with like a dog or a cat, right? And maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. There was a study that was done that showed people walking into a conference room or a room, and what they did is they took a rubber snake, right, a toy snake, and they put this on the floor, sort of behind the door, so that as people came in, you'd walk into the door, right? And as you turned around, you would see it. Now, what was very interesting is that most people, I think it was 96, 97% of people, immediately jumped or ran. And they did that before their brain could even process that it wasn't a real snake. Now think about that, right? If you have a situation where our brains are acting before we can even think, these are some of the unconscious triggers that we deal with every day. We see something happen and we make assumptions. We see something that is said, and this is the tragedy of some of social media. Some things that are said and they get taken out of context, and all of a sudden we react. We feel a certain way. You've all had those emails that you've sent, and afterwards you've gone, "Oh God, why didn't I just wait until tomorrow? I should have just slept on it, and I would have had a completely different reaction." Right? Our emotions and what we do is often not what we think about. And that's really important for us to consider now, because a lot of what we're going through in this turmoil, frankly, is not anchored to science. It's just anchored to how we feel. If I'd grown up and my family had told me that snakes were great, I might have walked in that door, turned around and gone, "Oh, what kind of snake is that?" Right? Instead of immediately jumping, because I would have been one of the jumpers. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen now for a second. We'll talk a little bit more now. So we've got these things that we need to consider, right? None of us have ever experienced this before. There's no data that tells us how we should do it, because the last pandemic we didn't have a global operating environment. We didn't have international trade and supply chains that ran from China to Australia through Africa and India and Asia. We didn't have that, right? And we have these human dynamics that affect how we work. The biggest thing though, this is the big takeaway. Fear is the biggest driver of our crisis response. There's no question about it. And if you think it's not, think about that snake example. Even a dead snake that posed absolutely no harm and no risk would have did drive a huge sense of fear in over 90% of the people who saw it. So the question now is, how do we mitigate fear? Because that's what we've got to do. If we can mitigate the fear of never having had this experience before, and frankly, the internal drivers that we have, we're going to be probably 10 steps ahead of the competition. All right, so there's 3 ways to do this, because we've got to anticipate where it comes from. It comes from a lack of predictability. I am fearful if I cannot predict. It also comes from a lack of control. I am fearful if I cannot control the situation. And finally, it comes from the fact that there's lack of an end in sight. If I don't know that this is ever going to end, I start to actually physiologically feel tired, and I start to shut down certain circuits. So let's talk about these in order. A lack of predictability. Well, what's interesting about this is that our brains are wired. I'm sure most of you this morning would have gone, and I'm going to ask you if you can please, I'm going to go to my chat. How many of you this morning remember brushing your teeth? I know it's an odd question, but just stick with me. So if you remember brushing your teeth this morning, I want you to put in there, you remember. But if you don't, then just say, okay, 2 people do. Okay, a lot of you remember. Now, the next question I have for you, great. Okay, I'm glad we've all got clean teeth. The next question I have for you is, do you remember explicitly the steps you went through to do that? Did you say to yourself, okay, it's 5 a.m. or whatever time you get up, or 9:15, and I've got to pick up this thing, and it's a long brush, and it's got little things on the end of it, and I've got to find something to go on top of it, so I'm going to find some lotion. How many of you remember the detailed steps of doing that? Versus just, right, it's on autopilot. Thank you, Kevin, and Andrew, it's just subconscious. Well, that's the point, right? And the reason why that happens, if you think about it this way too, I have 3 daughters, and two drive. But here's the interesting thing. When I get in the car and I'm kind of almost reversing or driving while I'm putting my seatbelt on. I know that's not really the way it should be done, but I'm kind of doing that, and I'm adjusting the mirrors because the kid's a bit shorter than I am, so I've got to move them up. When they get in the car, we don't move for 30 seconds because they're adjusting the mirrors, they're adjusting the seatbelt, they're moving the seat forward, they're checking back and forth. They're doing all of these things. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because in some part, our brains love predictability. And it is an efficient brain that can work through the predictability. An efficient brain is able to just get through things without thinking about it. Because if you had to think every morning about brushing your teeth, you would probably find that by 10 o'clock, you'd be exhausted. So we thrive on predictability, but when we don't have it, it's a huge problem. So we can create some predictability by starting to change a little bit of what's around us sometimes, because it also awakens and triggers us into being more aware of what's happening around us. So I want to tell you a story, and it's a great story, and you're probably thinking, why am I showing you a picture of pizza? It happens to be intentionally a Domino's pizza. And the story is great because the CEO, who I think is a terrific CEO, and if you ever want to do yourself a favor in terms of just a little mini case study, just Google Domino's and their stock symbol DPZ, as in Domino's Pizza, or DPZ, I guess. And you'll find it is an incredible story of a stock for essentially a pizza company. What could be more low tech than pizza, right? It's not Facebook, it's not Apple, it's pizza. And it's an incredible story about what they were able to do in the midst of the pandemic and the shutdown. Is they talk about having rewritten essentially their whole corporate standing operating procedures in about 60 days. Because they just said, you know what, this is a new normal, this is a new business. So what they ended up doing is they said, we're going to provide information to our teams. We're going to constantly tell them where things stand, even if we've got nothing to add. If you don't have information, it becomes harder and harder to predict. Think about your own situation that you're in. If you as a leader, or if you're just part of an organization, if you have not heard from your leadership team in some time, that is a huge challenge, because it means that your internal neurons are unable to give you any context about the situation that you're in. And without that, you can't predict. And if you can't predict, you're even, it's kind of frankly even in a worse situation, in as much as you're not even able to now act, essentially. So provide as much information as you can. But then the second one is run the business. So to the extent that you can, understand what you can control and what you can't control, which gets us to a little bit of one of the points coming up shortly. But run the business. There are things that happen every year at a certain period. I have clients that run their annual performance review process in April and March. March and April, and they said to me, we think we need to pause the review progress. And I said, well, the challenge with doing that is that you're now going to create even more uncertainty and more unpredictability. I absolutely appreciate that in some cases you may have to let people go. But if I don't have a review and I'm not told even how good I am or where I could improve, it's been to my disadvantage. So keep the processes running as best you can on the routine that you can. And if you can't do the whole thing, and in this case, this was a global client, and they actually had operations in Hong Kong, India, Mumbai. They were down in Sao Paulo, in London, and the US, New York, and then in Toronto. And they ran a modified version of a review process because they just said we can't do the whole thing in as much detail. And celebrate the progress you're making. So if you don't celebrate progress, people aren't sure whether or not what they're doing is actually helping you or not. Again, this comes back to human behavior. So if you tell me that I'm doing something that is different or even the same, but it is helpful, there's more chance that you're going to get me to do it again. All right, so we can address the lack of predictability, which helps our brains be more efficient. And if we can be more efficient, we can actually kind of find that we can start drawing on potentially new capabilities. And we can address the lack of predictability by doing a couple of things, those three on the screen. Let's talk next then about the next one, which is all this lack of control. This is a really, really powerful one, especially now, because most of us feel, and I'll come off again just for a second off the screen share, but most of us feel right now that we are not in control of the situation. If you're an employee, you're not making the decision necessarily about whether or not you're going to get a full paycheck or a part paycheck. You're not making the decision on what market you'll go into or what market you'll stop serving, what products you can or can't get. We don't know if our supply chain will be back up and running anytime soon. So we may not get what we need to be able to manufacture or supply. That makes us feel terrible because we love to feel like we're in control. It's one of our thriving mechanisms. But in the case of COVID, which again, I'll remind you, none of us have experienced before, and there's no data to tell us how we should act. We actually don't know how to control this. And it's this lack of control coupled with the lack of predictability now that start driving our anxiety levels and our anxiety levels up, and potentially our performance levels up for a little while, but then our performance levels start to decline. So at first it was great working from home. It was cool to try this out and sort of see, and it was nice to be around the kids for a few days. As I said, I've got 3 daughters and I love my children, and I need to be a dad, and I need to work, and I just need some me time, right? What is that even, right? You can't even go for a walk. Well, you can now, but you couldn't even go for a walk. So all of these things that made us feel like we could actually control things has suddenly changed. And so we're in a situation where we've lost this control. However, there are things that we can take to try and gain some of this control. Okay, what does that look like? Well, first of all, it's important to actually acknowledge what is controllable. Not everything is controllable. And by that, I mean the fact that you don't have a situation all the time where you can actually go and change everything. You can't impact your supply chain and your partners overseas. Okay, let's know that. What can we do to try and near source or find alternate sources to mitigate the fact that we can't influence when we're going to get our product, when the ports are going to open, when the planes are going to start flying again? You're not going to control that. So let's acknowledge what we can control and focus on that. And the minute you do that, something very important happens in our brains. What happens in our brains is we're able to then compartmentalize and go, okay, I can put this over there. I don't actually need to worry about it quite so much anymore. But here's what I can worry about and focus on and work on. It's really, really powerful to do that. If we don't do that, we constantly are going to try and solve all the problems, even the unsolvable ones, because we can't control them. And that makes us frustrated. It makes us tired. We don't feel like we're making progress, and it drives up our anxiety. The other thing that really great leaders do when they try and focus on this lack of control is there's 2 elements to any work, right? Well, there's many elements, of course, but there's 2 dimensions I want to cover here. One is the what you do. The what you do is your business. So, as I scroll back up and have a look, we've got people that are from the business school here. We've got people that are part of events planning organizations. Whatever it is that you do, that's the what that you do, right? That's your business. What you can do, though, is you can focus on the how, on how work is done. And what leaders tend to do is they fall into one of two camps. Initially, they're going to dive straight into the what. How, if I'm a lawyer, what do I do now? How do I do my job? Because I can't go to court. Filings are happening electronically. Cases are being delayed. That's going to impact my income and my flow. And so that's where people go. And in going there, they neglect the other dimension of work, which is how work can be done. Now, we haven't got time for it today, but I'm a huge proponent that the how dimension of work is probably more important even than the what dimension. Okay, why do I say that? Well, I think what's interesting here is that if you take the case of the two biggest competitors in the technology space, right, Apple and Microsoft, what is really curious is that Microsoft created devices that sit on most desktops in offices, and that was Bill Gates's vision and his quest, right, to make the computer accessible for everybody. But what then happened was a couple of things. Not only did Microsoft really become antagonistic with respect to antitrust and regulators, which kind of created a culture within them that how they did their work was to almost be combative. They would create great products, but they would also be combative. On the other hand, you've got someone like Steve Jobs, who arguably was not a particularly nice person, but created a culture where what they wanted to do is transform the world by how people use technology. So you've got two companies here. And frankly, if you look at Microsoft's story versus Apple's story, that's also very interesting if you look at their stock price, right? Apple was the first trillion-dollar company, not Microsoft. And it came from the fact that what Apple did is Apple was able to really focus on how work was done, how we embrace the product. I have an iPhone. It's how you embrace this product. And it's what it would do for us that would make our lives richer and better. They didn't focus only on the product. They focused on how we would interact with it and certainly how work would be done within the organization itself. So I really do feel that in this case, what a lot of leaders may do is they go straight to talking about what it is that they do. What you need to focus on, though, is index more on how work gets done and start playing a different role there. Let everybody have a role, no matter what level you're in. There was a wonderful sentiment that was done recently. Kraft Heinz is a company that makes tomato sauce, ketchup. They also make a whole lot of other things as well. And they've been in the news for a lot of bad reasons. I wrote a piece that was published on just their terrible culture, their cost-cutting culture. It wasn't set up to be a great story. But what they did in the midst of the pandemic was they really started to rewrite their own playbook. And they rewrote the playbook by talking about how everybody was showing up to help Americans in this case, because it was intended for American TV. But it was intended to show how everyone was showing up to really help those of us that were stuck at home have the products that we needed and so on. And so you had this company that had actually been quite torn apart by cost reduction, lots of bad moves. And they stopped for a moment and realized that's actually not really what this is all about. This is about us showing up at 2 o'clock in the morning to start a shift to make tomato sauce that's going to make kids who are home from school a little bit happier with the meal that their dad or their mom is trying to cook in between conference calls or Zoom calls, right? And it absolutely transformed how people felt about what they were doing in the midst of a crisis where they didn't have predictability and they didn't have control. So the idea of giving everybody a role is huge. And here's another fun example of that. So this appeared just a couple of days ago. Babe is a wine company, but they realized that, what happened in New York City, and I'm not sure to what degree it happened elsewhere in the world, but in New York City, nail salons were closed. And, my nails are just sort of regular nails, but clearly my kids and my wife liked getting their nails done occasionally. But when you haven't been able to get that done, that's not great. So what did they do? This is a wine company, right? A wine company realized, gosh, we've got these trucks that we can't use right now. But what would be great is actually if we set them up so that people could walk up, put their hands in, and get their nails done. Now, here's what's fascinating about that, right? This is a lack of control. I'm in a wine company. I can't get my supplies. My trucks are kind of not being used right now. But hey, what they did is they reached out and they said to their teams, what could we do? And somebody came up with this idea and they ran with it. They gave everybody a role to play with respect to saying, you know, there's something here that we can do. So again, just the reminder, give everyone a role to play, because ideas could come from anywhere. And at least that way you feel like you're adding some value. Now, there's a store in the US called Ikea, and this may be moving for you. The visual, it may not be moving. It doesn't matter. But Ikea is a huge store. Frankly, it looks like a warehouse, and it is predicated on flat packed goods, right? So what it is you see a chair and you go and buy this box and then you assemble it at home. That's how it works. But there's something that was fascinating. And again, remember, we're talking about behavioral science here. It's called the Ikea Effect. And so what it means, and it's a little bit like going to Builder's Warehouse and buying a whole bunch of wood and the drills and the screws to make something, right? Or it's going to a pottery store and getting the pottery and making a cup or a glass. And what it shows is that the labor that we invest in something drives up the product or the idea's value. So it may just be a cheap plywood particle board chair, but because I put time and effort into it, I've invested labor into it, the value now goes up. It's more valuable to me. I value it more. And this leads to a couple of things, and as a result of a couple of things. One is, I feel good. I feel like I've accomplished something. And when you feel like when you feel accomplishment, you kind of feel competent. And when you feel competent, it affects your confidence, right? And so if you feel confident, it's a positive feeling. So in the midst of everything else, we need to look for ways that we can help people play a role and put in a little bit of labor. And labor could be mental, could be physical, could be whatever, because it'll drive up the value of what they're working on. It also tends to focus on the product or the idea's attributes. So, you know, it's a cheap chair or it's a cheap table. But instead of it just being a cheap table, I now look at it and go, wow, that's a really nice table, right? I start looking at the fact that it's got legs that are adjustable, or I could put them in different ways. But the most fascinating part of this whole thing, and there's very few cases where this happens, is it changes the relationship between effort and liking. Not a lot of us like how much we have to work out, right? To sort of end up with your let's get on the beach body. Some of us do, but most people don't. What is interesting about the Ikea effect is that you're able to actually increase the relationship between effort and liking. And by doing that, we're actually able to get people to work more at effort, which is just fantastic. And it's what we all want. Frankly, it's the fulfillment that I want, and I'm sure that you all want too. So the last thing that I want to touch on, I said there were 3 reasons why we end up with this paralysis, why we don't act and why we feel confused, right? One was the lack of control. The one was lack of predictability. The other is a lack of an end in sight. We do not know when this is going to end. I've been following the levels and the lockdown and all of that kind of stuff, and we don't know. No one knows. Everyone waits with bated breath to see what's going to happen. The question to ask is, what might be possible if we ... and to get your whole team, your whole organization thinking about that. What might be possible if, when this is over, we're able to impact even more people through our products or through the services that we provide? What will that look like? How will it feel? And if you can start to target aspirationally, not just right now about how terrible things are, because they are, right? People who stay at a company when others have been let go will often feel survivor's guilt. It's not always a pleasant place to be. It's not a pleasant experience to have. People have lost their jobs, their livelihoods, and I understand that. And at the same time, those people that remain, let's see if we can focus them differently. Walmart in America just did something interesting where they took 160 stores, I think it was, and through conversations that they'd been having, they said, what are we going to do to help? We're dialing up our supply chain, our trucks are running day and night. What can we do to try and impact how Americans are feeling right now? And somebody came up with the idea of saying, well, you know, when our stores are closed at night, why don't we turn them into drive-in movie theaters? And that's what they've done. And you've got people who feel really, really great and proud to be a part of Walmart as a result of what they're going to try and do. So by asking that question, what might be possible if we, and leave it to run. The last thing that I want to touch on is just sort of, there's a science to this piece too, and it's the network effect. And I'm sure some of you have heard of the network effect. And the idea behind the network effect, which is Metcalfe's law, and it was talked about initially with the telephone, right? So the idea, and I'll stop sharing just for 1 second again, the idea with the telephone is that one telephone on its own is no good, right? You need somebody else with a telephone so that you can both use it. And then if you have, so if you have a phone, not much good. One other person has a phone. Now those two people can talk to one another. You have a third people. You have a third person now with a phone. Now you can have that third person talking to either one, and those two, the original two, talking to each other. So it increases. You have a fourth person, and now there's multiple options that you can have, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that as that grows, that's really what you want with a network. You want it to grow, you want it to expand. And the bigger it can be, the better. But what's interesting is that there's a word that we use, and we often don't think of its origins, but the word is congestion. And congestion, often we'll talk about the fact, the downside of a network that becomes inefficient, right? It's a congested network. I can't get through. Or I can't, you know, there's so many planes coming in from so many, well, not now, but there's so many airplanes coming in from so many different places. My time to take off or land has been delayed because of congestion. Again, the network effect. But what's interesting about this is that we can apply it to businesses. So what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, I mean this. You've got a situation where you can go ahead and look on the right-hand side there, and you'll see how all of those people are connected to one another. What's great about it for those of us, I'm a bit of a geek myself, is that there's actually a formula for this. And the formula is that you're going to just take the number of people, multiply it by itself less 1, divide by 2. So you can do the math. And the reason why I'm showing you that, showing you this, is that if we can get not just one person or not just two people managing their lack of control, managing the lack of predictability, if we can get rid of the fear in more and more and more people, it becomes contagious. If I feel good, we can start talking about how it might impact others, right? And so on and so forth. So the idea here is that we're able to actually really go on and say, okay, there's a role that we can play with respect to trying to impact and frankly help eliminate fear. So the bottom line in all of this is really that we've got 3 things that we could do right now to try and eliminate fear. Fear is what we've got to reduce. We won't eliminate it, but reduce it. We can make smart decisions, we can make bad decisions, and we're probably going to make some of both. But the degree to which we can actually focus on increasing predictability where you can, increasing control, or my sense of control where I can. And even if you can't tell me, because no one can, when coronavirus and COVID is going to end, let me know that when there is an end in sight, we're going to have the opportunity to do something great. And we get to play in that space a little bit differently. So I'm going to pause now. And Randall, I think you said that you'd be facilitating some Q&A. So let's go there. And if you've got questions, either send them in. I don't know how we want to do it, but I'm going to just let you run with that.
Thank you very much, Russell, for that interesting discussion and talk. Sort of underlining the fact that human behavior is at the center of our crisis in this world and how we should be able to control things for ourselves. I'm going to open the floor to the panel and to the audience to actually list their questions. I think it's better if you maybe put up your hand, or if you are able to type in your question in the webinar chat section. And that is where we will then be able to direct your questions to Russell, or Russell, you'll be able to pick them up yourselves. But Russell, whilst you're waiting for them to collect their thoughts and maybe come up with some questions for you, I think the important thing for us at the business school in this COVID-19 and the lockdown and its impact on the economy and organizations, both big and small, our biggest question was, how do we become winners? You have touched on a number of things that could happen, that could be done by leaders, and it's all about leadership. And the business school in itself, our business school particularly, prides itself actually on honing in business education on the whole leadership ethos, how leaders can actually make a difference. And you've actually taught us in this particular talk also that if we don't actually get that act together, we will actually be finding ourselves in a crisis even more. So leaders also come out better in a crisis and in adversity, and you've given us some indication on that. I like the talk that the points that you've raised around the 4 categories of reasons people fail to act. That is process, people, structure, and culture, and particularly the concept of organizational atrophy. If you could perhaps for a minute just pause there again, because many of our audience members are leaders in organizations, and I would like you maybe just to pause there again, just to maybe polish up again some of the thoughts that could come out of that. Thank you, Russell.
Yeah, sure. You know, I think I do not like the expression that, you know, great leaders or organizations don't waste a crisis. I think that's just, I'm just not a fan of sort of some of the connotations around a crisis and wasting it. But here's, so forget that. But what I would say is that COVID is presenting us with a unique opportunity, I think, to do things differently. So, and I'm going to reflect for a moment on us as individuals for a second, because honestly, a lot of organizations will just continue doing what they've done. But for a moment, let's just think about the individual. If we've all got rough edges as leaders. Some of us work for leaders, and those leaders have got rough edges. We've all got them. And if, for instance, we haven't had for a long time a great culture around getting everybody involved in, for instance, decision making, and I'm not saying every decision has to be involved, everyone has to be involved in, but if we haven't been in a situation where we've involved or invited at least people to be a part of ideation, thinking about new things, and celebrating success when failure happens, those things inform your culture. And I've seen leaders, and I've encouraged some leaders through this crisis to start looking a little bit differently at their own leadership style, and to say, you know what, I want to emerge from this. I have the opportunity to emerge from this as a less autocratic or a less hierarchical organization. A lot of work's being done around generational differences in the workplace. Some of it's very valid, and some of it I think is just press and media blowing up sort of a talk line. But the fact of the matter is that I think about what my kids are learning at school right now. They're learning more at school right now than I think, you know, I did 1 or 2 years of math. Maybe I had to redo 1 or 2 of those at university. But what they're doing now is probably more advanced than what I did then. So we've got a generation that arguably is a little bit smarter than we were when we entered, but certainly we have experience that the generation doesn't. So I do think that there's an element here of being able to say, you know what, let's figure out how we can leverage and tap into this formal education by letting people be more sort of involved in ideation. So back to my original point here, I've encouraged leaders to say, you know what, if I wasn't initially very inviting of other opinions, I'm going to be now. I'm going to emerge. I'm going to take this as an opportunity to emerge as a new leader, and I'm going to do things differently because I want a different outcome for this organization, or for me, or for my team. So use it as such, and people will actually be quite, certainly my experience has been, will be quite tolerant and forgiving of a personal journey that a leader wants to work through. I'm going to just dash to a couple of the questions I've got come in. So Prakash, you sent a note, I'm part of essential services. How do you remain positive when each and every day more and more healthcare workers become become positive, I guess, with the test, right? And are not able to come to work. I think there's a couple of dimensions here. Thank you for your work being part of Essential Services. I do think, you know, it's an understated form of thanks. It's easy to say thank you, but certainly I think a lot of us on the call feel that very deeply. And it is hard. It's going to get harder. And my experience just from having seen it in New York and certainly with my wife is that it gets harder as more people become positive and can't come in. The days get longer. The crises become more intensified as family members can't say goodbye to loved ones and they have to do that via WhatsApp or FaceTime or whatever. We're probably going to look back on this year as a year that had such an incredible impact on all of us personally. I can't give you some glib sort of 3 or 4 things to do. But what I would say is just reflecting on the fact that, and acknowledging, honestly, that were it not for the role that you play and that others play, this crisis would probably be a lot bigger and a lot more intense. And just find your way of seeking out people who like you. You know, you nourish each other's souls, look for the positivity that you can. And remember that it will pass. We don't know how fast, we don't know how quickly, and we don't know what the ramp up will be before we get to the other side of it. But you know, thank you for what you're doing in terms of supporting that.
So there's quite a number of questions there still. So if you want to go on to
Randall,
the next one.
Yeah, I'll just move on.
Yeah.
The principle of working. So does the principle of working smarter and not harder still hold true? Gosh, that's really interesting because there are things right now that are going back to sort of almost analog, and it's a case of just how much can we do in the time that we have to get something shipped out the door. And I'm not looking for smart ideas. I just want to get the product out the door. I don't know that it's ever been an either or. I think certainly right now we do need smart ideas to solve some problems that we've never faced before. And at the same time, Andrew, it's kind of an and. I do think we've also got to make sure that we're working harder because we will find to the point that was made from the healthcare worker from Prakash that it's going to get harder and harder and harder, and smart isn't necessarily going to cut that. Would love to hear. All right, so I'll answer this one quickly. My journey, I did my journey to New York, what my experience has been since I made the move. Very quickly, I did not plan to come to America. I actually didn't really want to come to America. I was working in Joburg, and I thought, gosh, it'll be interesting to go and sort of see another part of the world. And I would have gone anyway. China, Australia, Asia, India, anyway. And an opportunity came up, and I met my wife, who ironically is not from here either, but nonetheless. Long story. Please hit me up on LinkedIn if you want to chat more. I'd love to. How do we relate fear with knowledge and understanding of what needs to be done? I'm basing this question in a situation where we can't control growth of infections and lockdown that has an impact on the growth economy. How do we relate fear with knowledge and understanding of what needs to be done? You know, I think if I understand your question accurately, there's a point here where what we have seen is that knowledge alone is not going to be enough to get people to actually take action and to do what they need to do. It's all about emotional triggers. And that's why I didn't index this presentation on how great some companies have done, because they have done really well. It's about the behavior side of things. So I think what we need to do is we really need to make a lot of people sort of consider 2 things. One is huge fear around what could happen if we become positive, but there are things that we can do to not catch the virus, right? Wear your face covering, try and do your social distancing, because keeping the economy going is critically important at the same time for income and for food and just for basic essentials. And we need to get unemployment back up. I mean, employment back up. Unemployment is just off the charts, and we've got to fix that. And I think part of it is the emotion, part of it is the knowledge, the facts, the data tells us that. But then if we're able to try and get to the point where we can help people understand what this means for them. I might have a job, but somebody else doesn't. And so how can we make sure that I don't become one of those, or we help others to get it? I don't know that I've sufficiently answered that. I think I'm probably rushing just a little bit, because I see a bunch of questions.
There's quite a few more. So if you can.
I think one of the questions is, how do we convince leaders to take the next step as some are still currently stuck in their own inertia? You know, a lack of agility from leadership. And it's really tough right now. I've seen that as well. It's lack of agility, there's inertia, there's atrophy, and leaders who have titles. But, you know, I've always said that it's times like this when you see a leader's true mettle, you see what they really are made of. Being able to sort of come out and first empathize with people. Now, what's interesting is I don't think you can convince a leader to take the next step. I think what we need to do is we need to create experiences for those leaders to understand that what they're doing is insufficient. You can't convince me of something. I need to believe it. And so I think the best thing, Kevin, to answer your question, is not to take an approach of how do you convince somebody. It's not about writing a white paper or doing something like that. It's about actually creating an experience. And maybe the business school can bring the leaders together and say, what experience can we create that might ultimately trigger in me a personal awakening where I think I need to do something differently, and leave to then take action. Because action comes from belief. Action is not going to come from somebody convincing me that I need to do something differently. In fact, I might get defensive and just hunker down even more. How to increase the value of a product, Ikea Effect. So what it is you actually aren't necessarily increasing the value of the product, you're increasing the value of the perceived value of the product, right? And the value to me. So a pen is a pen, right? It's a 20-cent big pen wherever you are, or a $2 big pen, whatever, 2 Rand, whatever. But what IKEA have done is they allow me to customize this and build it myself. So they give me all of the components, right? And I can't take it apart, but they give me all the components. And because I've now built the pen, I've invested effort into it. And that effort has led it to having a perceived higher value. So now I'm not going to leave this big pen lying around. I want to go, where's my big pen? Where's the pen that I built? And again, what you're tapping into, and this is the phenomenon of IKEA and every shop like it, is that when you tap into the notion that I can actually do something and build it, that's how the value goes up. So you don't actually increase the objective value here. The value that I'm going to have, I actually can't even place a number on it, but it's going to be different to yours, but it's certainly more than just the value, the sum of these components. There's a question for you, Dr. Jonas. Why don't you take that one and then I'll come back. Paul's got one as well, but I'll let you answer that one too, because I've been doing a lot of the talking.
Okay. I didn't expect any questions to myself, but some leaders from big organizations become very anxious due to the turnover not the same as before COVID. What advice would you give such leaders? I'm going to park that question for now. I think we're going to run out of time. It's going to take some more time to answer that question. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left before, and we want to do a close. We will put the video on YouTube as well, if you don't mind, Russell. But if you can maybe deal with Paul's question, and then we're going to have to just sort of wrap up the session. Thank you.
So thanks, Paul. So Paul's question, you mentioned the value of networks, but already there's talk of shorter supply chains and focus on local economies, and there seems to be a tension between the digital global village and more national interest. Well, I think without question, nearshoring, near sourcing is going to rise. And unfortunately, in the US, there's been so much talk about nationalism and sort of just this lack of a global economy. And COVID in a way has played into that by sort of demonstrating, well, this is why we don't want to sort of import goods from other parts of the world. So in some cases, it's probably going to have a little bit of a positive impact because it's going to drive economies that previously weren't being driven in certain sectors. The network itself, though, globally can at least absolutely to the point of still being valid. I mean, we're living in 8 billion people living in a global world. We need to have networks that cross borders. There's just no way we can be isolationist. But I do think you're right. Supply chains are having to deal with that. I'm going to post a short a link in the chat as well for a white paper that we wrote, which kind of dives into some of this just a little bit more. It might be helpful. But I do think in the near term, thinking about the network and just the network within your organization. Stop thinking about organizations as a hierarchy. Stop thinking about it as an org chart. Think about it as a network. Because if we can do that, we can layer on more impact and start treating, frankly, I hope, everybody, and this is probably my close too. I think I'd like us to get to the point where we can all start treating everybody in an organization as having a valid role to play. I did some work with Sapi Mondi many years ago in Mpumalanga. And I remember on one of the big paper lines, and making paper is a long process, but if something happens, you know, on a line at the start, by the time it gets to the end, you've got to clean it, you've got to, if the line stops. And I saw this gentleman who every day when the line went down, he would have to run sort of 40 or 50 meters to get a hose pipe, turn it on, run back, clean it, run back, turn it off, run back to be at the station. And I said, why can't you just use the tap behind you? And he said, well, no one's ever asked me, but it's broken. And if we could fix it, we could probably save, you know, however much time. But because people saw a hierarchy and they saw this person towards the bottom of the hierarchy, and they didn't think he had an idea or anything that was helpful or valuable. And so if we think about ourselves as a network where a leader is no higher than anybody else, and everybody has a contribution to play relative to their role, I think we could absolutely start to think a little bit differently, not just about the work world, but the role that we play in it as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Russell, for taking out the time to chat to us this afternoon, and also to our audience and participants that have actually taken out the time to listen to this very, very informative and insightful discussion. We want to thank also to our team that made this possible, and we'll be coming up with a third installment in the series. There's about 3 or 4 more. We'll share more details with all of you later. Russell, just like a word of thanks from our advisory board on behalf of the chairperson as well, and on behalf of the university for remaining a friend and an alumnus of the university, and also, of course, sharing your expertise with our advisory board. We wish you well on the side of New York, and all the best for you and your family. Well, thank you very much once again.
And wishing you all well in winter, coming into spring, hopefully in a few weeks, a few months. Keep well, everybody. It's tough times. Thank you very much, though.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot for you. And thank you very much also for our beautiful music that we are using coming from our choir at the university. Thank you, Russell, and all the best. Cheers.